All right, it is 2:35 p.m. and my name is Dr. Chris Inman with Online at JSU. I'm a senior instructional designer, and I am pleased to have Andrea Rains here to talk to us a bit today about engaging students in online courses. Andrea is an instructor in kinesiology, and she has been teaching online for quite some time, and she has a lot to share uh, with us. Hold on, I think someone's moving. Yeah, sorry about that. So, thank you for being here, Andrea, and I'm going to pass it along to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris, for asking me to share, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I know that time gets away and life gets away, and each semester we're as ready for midterm, I think, as students are, and um, just trying to be intentional about practicing what I preach. And I think doing these talks and leading some of these discussions is similar to serving on a search committee, maybe not quite that painful. Um, but it is one of those aspects of service that challenge you, that make you think about things, that make you reflect, that force you into collaborative circles where maybe we don't make that time. So I do love it each time that I'm asked to do it. And I am definitely honored that I'm continued um, to be offered the opportunity to share. So, in thinking about how we engage students and how I engage students, I enjoy digging through the resources and looking for new or better or different ways. And it forces me to have conversations that I normally might not have. So instead of just kind of going through a blanket PowerPoint, I just wanted to share a little window into my world of research and reading and exploring what engagement looks like and how do we engage students. So I found this first area that I'm going to talk about in my rules for engagement and looking at engagement a little bit differently. So sometimes we look at it through learning domains, sometimes we look at it through learning theories or strategies, sometimes we look at it through how we're changing things up or saying things differently or how we're assessing learning. But I think most importantly, I really liked this graphic that I found on Twitter a few months ago about looking at it through the lens of engaging students on through a framework of emotional, behavioral, and cognitive. And so that's really where a lot of this comes from. And I think the important point for me to remember is the balance that's necessary um, to be able to see that one method and means of engagement isn't going to work for all students in all areas, but that, oh, and of course that link's not working right out of the gate. That's awesome. Um, but we have to meet them where they are, and we have to look at it through, I can probably just expand this so you can see this. Perfect. Through how are we going to engage them cognitively? Because I think that's where we focus. That's where we spend a lot of our engagement effort and resources into the learning strategies, the questioning and the feedback, and creating the experiences that are going to contribute to their engagement. But I think sometimes that we overlook or maybe assume that the other aspects are happening more natively than they probably are. And so, looking at emotional engagement, how you're creating a community of learning, how you're inviting students to engage with each other in areas or spaces where they may feel like they're siloed. I'm in building strong relationships of trying to see and to respect and value not only other people's perspectives and opinions, but other people as individuals. I think we continue to see the lack of emotional engagement as headlines cross the landscape of key figures and personalities that are not attending to the emotional or behavioral engagement before they do things that are really questionable. But then the growth mindset that we all want students to have instead of the fixed, it has to be this one way and I have to learn one particular set of pathways and strategies is getting them to adopt the understanding that they're not going to have it all together, because I don't think we have it all together, but I think we have to model that. And so some ways we do that to get them to engage in that is to demonstrate what it looks like, sometimes incorrectly as much as correctly. Behaviorally, looking at things that you establish in your class as norms, holding students accountable, but then also getting them to be willing to work together with each other and learn and justify using restorative practices to resolve conflict. I think that conversations that I have with colleagues continue to produce questions or comments or concerns about the way that today's student can struggle sometimes. And I think it's because today's learner and even today's educator struggle to meet some of those emotional and behavioral engagement needs. This next article is speaking to looking at why students disengage. So if we need to understand how they're engaging and why they're engaging, I think we also have to take a look at what happens when they disengage. So I found these questions in this ASCD article that I really liked, that kind of gave me some examples of ways that I could create some of these emotional learning spaces that allow for students to feel like they are in a place where they can share and are willing to share. And so some examples are these open-ended questions like, tell me about a time when you learned something you were interested in learning. What did you do to help yourself? Another one, what is an idea, a topic, or a project you're doing right now that really interests you? Another, if you make plans, how do you carry them out? What do you do? What do you find to be easy about school? What's more difficult? What learning strategies would you recommend to a future student taking this class? And I think asking some of those questions, especially on the front end as class begins, model and demonstrate that environment of creating a space where you are wanting to know about students and about how they learn, because finding out the answers to these questions, I think, not only forces you to think about the different ways that students learn, but also shows them that you are a little bit more invested in trying to make the learning unique and individualized for them. So those are some questions that I plan to use in the spring in some of the introductory assignments and discussions to try to create that environment that makes them feel more supported, that makes them feel like it is a safe place and that it is an area that, I'm interested in and invested beyond just telling them that I am. So as we're looking and exploring and unpacking, why students disengage, figuring out where they engage, asking those questions, I think is the first step. So then in looking at what do we do when they disengage, very rarely, as the research points us toward, is the behavior a direct result or really the problem. There's usually a lot more buried underneath why students disengage or whatever the correct behavior is. So investigating and recognizing and figuring out what some of those barriers are is very important. If we're going to get them to engage, then I think we have to figure out where we're missing the mark or where they're struggling, where some of those gaps might be. So if the challenge presents as the student mental mindset, the barrier might be they don't see the purpose. They don't believe they have the ability to learn it. So one example of a teaching approach to use is explaining that value and increasing the ownership. And I think that today's learner especially, they seek out the desire to have agency, to have ownership, to have for things to have meaning, but they don't necessarily possess the skills to be able to bridge those two together naturally. So I think that's where we have to help them explore some of those concepts to be able to address that barrier where they feel like that there's the lack of investment. Maybe the challenge is metacognition or self-regulation. And that happens sometimes when the learner feels like they might be overconfident about knowledge or skills, like they feel like they have a wider knowledge base. And so they don't devote the attention to it that really creates that deep learning. A way to address that is to create more reflective assignments, to teach them about planning, to help guide them through monitoring and adjusting their learning. Maybe students have fear and mistrust. Maybe that's a challenge that presents. And the underlying barrier might be that the student teacher relationship has been damaged. And that can be for a variety of reasons that are even going to have to be unpacked a little bit further than what has caused that damage. But one approach to address that is to focus on credibility, to try to restructure the feedback, to try to have some dialogue and discussion with the learner to be able to restore that place where they're willing to listen. Because I know you've all seen the meme about Maslow before Bloom, but if they don't know you care, then they're not going to be in a place where they feel like they can learn.
Hey, Andrea,
Hey,
can you increase the screen size, the size of the PowerPoint? There we go.
is that better?
Yeah, one of the questions is there any way to make the presenter screen bigger? So, thank you.
Yeah. So another challenge that might present in thinking about how and why students disengage is that they don't have the prior knowledge that they need to be able to build the skills. So the barrier underlying might be that the prerequisite skills weren't learned or weren't taught, or maybe they weren't developed enough to be able to achieve mastery so that they can build on that knowledge, or that maybe they can't build the connections of being able to extend that knowledge. So initial assessments are a strategy that help give some additional background, the use of academic language and academic vocabulary, and intentionally trying to build the fluency in that vocabulary is a strategy that can help to increase that area. Maybe misconceptions is the issue. So maybe there's the misconception about the topic. Maybe it was inaccurate information, or maybe something happened that connection just didn't really hit home. Some strategies to use might be advanced organizers, things that you can do to recognize the common misconceptions in certain areas, invite students to justify their responses. Maybe it was from ineffective learning strategies. Maybe it was just from something that student just didn't resonate with, something that a strategy that just didn't work for that student, and so they missed the opportunity. Maybe they don't have the learning skills. Maybe they need help developing their study skills. So actually teaching those study skills, and I know that sounds crazy to think about in higher education, but I do think that some basic study skills and note taking and just some basic strategies, think alouds, aren't things that today's learner naturally has practiced and has developed enough to be able to apply it. A transfer of learning, maybe they can't apply the new knowledge. I think I probably see this one most often if I'm thinking about students historically that have disengaged and really trying to drill down to why they might have been a little bit more reluctant. Maybe it was just that barrier. So a strategy for that might be to plan some different tasks, maybe to differentiate in certain ways. And we'll go through some ways that we can do that a little bit more with some examples and some scenarios in just a few minutes. But maybe the tasks need to be in different contexts. Maybe the feedback needs to be differentiated. Maybe the student needs something to help process the task. Maybe there's selective attention. So today's learner and today's, I think, professional feels like they can multitask and can't find the right area to focus, or is too stimulated by other things. So we can address that from the perspective of trying to increase our clarity, to use breaks, to segment the learning, to break it apart, to try to really model not trying to multitask, but trying to simplify. I think that's one of the most common engagement tips that I saw in the research, was to try to streamline and simplify what you're trying to get students to accomplish. Constraints of mental effort and working memory. If the task is too complex, or if there's too much information, if the information is too new, then that's where chunking the content into smaller modules becomes very important, and being sure that you're using some more universal design strategies of trying to support both the visual and auditory areas to try to help them to retrieve what's in the working memory that they're struggling with. So when we're thinking about asking about student engagement and how we can motivate it, there's no one area or reason that is caused the disengagement, but it's multifaceted. So we really have to think of ways that we can partner with students alongside getting courses together and delivering content, both individually and collectively, to try to get to the reason that the student is struggling and to support whatever that is so that the student can be successful. This next performance success graphic shows the combination of knowledge, skills, environment, and motivation, and how you need all of those to generate the most likely scenario and setup for student success. And so you can see in the graphic that if any one of these components is missing, then the common attitudes or mindsets or feelings that you might see displayed by the learner, and it can vary, but for the most part, if it's a knowledge gap, if you've got the skills, the environment, and the motivation, but the knowledge really isn't there, then anxiety might be what you see from the learner. If it's a skill gap, if the knowledge is there, the environment is right, the motivation is there, but there's just certain skills that are deficient, that need some support, then frustration is a common attitude or mindset from the learner. If the environment is the deficit, if they've got the knowledge and the skills and the motivation, but the environment is not in a place where they can learn, where they feel like they are supported and they're emotionally and physically and psychologically safe, then they're going to feel trapped. They're going to feel like where they kind of get in that fight or flight mode where they feel like that they can't move and are not sure which way to turn. And then when the motivation is the problem, when that's the area that they need the most support, apathy is when they just feel like that that nothing matters. And so if we're going to really create student success, and if we're looking at ways to engage students to generate student success, I think we really have to figure out why they're disengaging and to try to support them and meet them where they are. This top 10 list of ways to engage students virtually, keep it simple was the most common one, involve them in the learning, set goals, track goals, allow second chances, include movement, take screenshots or screencasts, celebrate the wins, work together, and check in on each other. So sometimes if it's a process or an understanding problem from that aspect, then you doing a little screen share or a little video tutorial that you can do even on your phone, you don't have to necessarily do on the computer, is a good way to be able to walk a student through a situation to get into the next step. Sometimes those video tours or tutorials is something that is a good idea on the front end of something that maybe is a complex task or process or something that might be unfamiliar. One way that is used as far as online engagement might be if you were doing like a virtual walkthrough of your course and how to navigate the spaces and the areas and how to work through the assignments and explaining some of the way that you want things done in your online course. I think probably one of the most important for me though is after we're setting goals and tracking goals is to allow second chances. So I know that there's conflicting questions and thoughts and reasons about why the one chance is the one chance. But I just feel like if we're really trying to value the learning and we're really trying to engage students, if a student feels like, they've absolutely missed the chance to be able to be successful, then they completely disengage. Um, and then I think we're teaching compliance maybe instead of investment. So I think we have to find a balance of what that can look like reasonably. I really liked this goal setting blog about how to make thinking visible. So sometimes for students, it can be just a scenario of not knowing where to start. So I really liked this kind of goal setting work plan. And this would work, from a course planning perspective to engage students, but would also work from a student perspective of a support if they were needing, just kind of a way to get started of what is the goal? What do I need to accomplish in this assignment, to give them a starting point, to help them think critically, and pick out the important pieces to be able to know where to start and how to kind of track their own progress. And after they set the goal, then they have to make the plan. What is it? How am I going to do it? What do I need to do? Is there an order that it needs to be done in? How much time do I think this is going to take? And what resources do I need? And then what are the routines that they can put in place to check and monitor their progress? Maybe that is putting in an assignment in the or utilizing the calendar option to sync to their device to have the due dates. But then beyond that, using the calendar on their device even to schedule themselves time to work on those particular aspects, or even maybe to give them enough time to kind of plan out when and how and where those things need to happen. And then take strategic action. So giving them, the charge and the challenge to take the ownership of the learning, but to give them the agency and the flexibility to be able to decide where those things are going to fall, and reflecting on the process. So making the feedback loop go full circle is looking at what worked well, what didn't work, what were the mistakes, what were the misconceptions, what was learned, and what would need to be done differently. So sometimes it can just be as simple as helping them to make their learning visible. Teaching students how to manage feedback, I think we can all attest to how just as individuals, we don't always do the best with constructive feedback, and teaching students and modeling students how to critique and how to analyze and how to give constructive feedback, be that motivational or positive or strictly corrective, that helping them to sort through that, I think it becomes very important in being able to keep them engaged, because I think oftentimes students take personally the feedback on maybe something that they felt like was better than it was. But helping them to be reflective practitioners, we have to model that. We have to create the space. We have to give them the time and the opportunity to see what feedback looks like, and to compare feedback and to give feedback. And I think that that's very important, um, and how that keeps them engaged. Because if they don't ask for feedback, if they don't know how to ask for feedback, then I think sometimes that's why students disengage as well. Finally, to keep them engaged and kind of to sum up the rules of engagement, I loved this article about not spamming your students, about being strategic in your communication. And in an online course, that can be, through a weekly announcement check-in. It could be through sometimes I'll just open a Teams meeting and just let them do it like virtual office hours and just let them drop in. When COVID shut the world down initially, I would intentionally schedule just a weekly check-in so that they could come and have that time to have questions about projects or assignments, or to try to create the space that the face-to-face classroom and discussion time allows. So I think that maybe some of that is valuable enough to do and to continue to do in an online environment, just to utilize a protected space where students feel like they can ask questions, where they can get help, and then taking responsibility for student engagement, for their interactions. So, you can't make them do the work, but I think we could definitely all do more to try to build rapport, to flip the classroom, to use breakouts or small groups, and to open up Q&A. And I think that, in some of those ways, that these 4 tips that came from this Campus Learn article really kind of summarize those 3 areas of behavioral and emotional and cognitive support. So now, how do we do that? I like to give you some actionable tips. I like to give you some examples, and of course, give you some technologies that will allow that to happen. So I'll spend just a few minutes going over some of my favorite evidence-based practice assessment and differentiation tips. I use the 5E model when I'm planning lessons and modules. I feel like it's straightforward enough that students can understand it. But I train teachers, so I also teach them to use a variety of instructional matters or models as well. So for those of you that are not familiar, the 5E model for lesson planning is engage, explore, explain, extend, and evaluate. And so in this collection that I shared in the chat, you have access to lots of different ways that that this works. And so in the engagement part is where you're helping them to access prior knowledge, you're creating the connections to things they might know before, framing ideas. But I like this graphic because it shows how the teacher behaves and how the student behaves in that particular area or that segment. And then the explore phase is where new concepts are being explored and new skills are being discovered, asking questions, examining thinking, building relationships. That's where we as the teachers become facilitators of learning, and we try to interact, we try to ask good questions, and we try to give some productive struggle time to think and to engage cooperatively. Then we move to explain. So we're connecting prior knowledge and background to new discoveries. So we're explaining how what they know builds and flows into what we need them to know. And then we do some intentional work connecting the language. So trying to build the vocabulary, especially if it's new content. We're encouraging students to explain what they know, to explain what their thinking is, and to fill in the gaps for what we feel like might be misconceptions or confusions. Then we're going to move into extend and elaborate, where we apply new learning or learning possibly in a similar situation. That's the different context aspect, and when we're communicating the new understanding, but we're intentionally using the language of what we're trying to get students to learn. That's using the prior knowledge, the prior experiences, the things that students already possess, using that to help to engage the learning, to help to support the application and the understanding of the new concepts. And then finally, we're going to evaluate each of those 4 E's, and maybe that's with a self-assessment or peer assessment. I use a lot of peer assessment, using the same rubrics that I'm going to be formally evaluating competencies on. I'll have them to self-assess first, but then to peer assess each other and each other's work. And that just helps to give them a better understanding of what the assessment is designed to do, and to give them some practice and some confidence using it. I think that can deepen their learning and their understanding, and it gives them an opportunity then to become the teacher in a peer assessment environment. So I won't go through each of these, but there are several specific ways that you could use this, like in a lesson format, of how you might use the 5E model of, what was the prompt, what did you want them to accomplish, what are the directions, what's the task, what do you want them to do, for each of the E's: engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. And I think in an online environment, especially, that the consistency that builds is helpful to keep students a little bit more engaged, whatever the model is that you choose. Maybe you want to explore some other evidence-based practices. Maybe you are a big Bloom's taxonomy fan. Maybe you are not a Bloom's taxonomy fan. Regardless of which basis of thinking you have, um, there's all kinds of bodies of research to support whole part whole. If you feel like that Bloom's is kind of not in your wheelhouse, but there's lots of great information about how Bloom's taxonomy specifically applies to our disciplines and how we can use that to support learning. Marzano's high yield strategies, getting students to identify similarities and differences, summarizing and note taking, some skills that I feel like students don't always have natively when they get to us. Reinforcing effort, celebrating the wins, providing the space for recognition. Homework and practice, especially when new skills are involved. Non-linguistic representations, cooperative learning. Maybe you are a fan of Bloom's taxonomy. So if you are, here's a great article for how you can leverage Bloom's to elevate your discussion boards. Maybe you don't love discussion boards and you don't use discussion boards. I use Flipgrid in lieu of discussion boards. I feel like that Flipgrid is, for me, getting the students to be willing to capture themselves on video to respond to a prompt, or maybe to explain how they understand something, or to deepen their learning. I feel like is a little bit more organic for me than where they feel like they have to write what I want to hear. I think I get a little bit truer representation of where they are and what they're thinking, using a digital video discussion platform like Flipgrid. And Flipgrid natively integrates with Canvas, which is really nice as well. But if we're thinking about Bloom's and how we can strengthen the quality of our discussion boards, I think it's important to strengthen the quality of our prompts. So sometimes that's using a different verb. Sometimes that's finding a language function that's going to get them to move up the list of, or up the pyramid of Bloom's, to get to move from a just general recollection of facts and just a quiz, even if it's pen and paper, but just spitting back information, to actually being able to understand by explaining the ideas, or to apply the concepts by using them in new situations, to analyze them by drawing connections from one idea to the next, to evaluate concepts by justifying a decision with evidence from research or even from data. And then finally, being able to create, which is the top, which is where we want them all to get, but they don't all kind of start there. And that's to produce new or original work. But sometimes the prompt and the writing engagement aspect can be strengthened to strengthen that area. For thinking about some evidence-based practices. I talked a little bit about this in the spring, if you attended the spring session, about how we can engage students through assessment. So I included some of those resources again, because assessment for learning, of learning, is very important in deciding how you're going to use assessment meaningfully, how you're going to use assessment both formatively, to check learning as it's happening, as well as summatively toward the end. And I gave several examples in the spring of different choice boards that could be used. And I think that choice boards offer students the agency and the ownership to feel like that they have options. So it requires a little bit more front end attention. But just one example of this exit ticket choice board that I found, I don't know, a few weeks ago, to see using technology. So you let them choose any three. And so for the most part, if it's a grid structure of a choice board, then they can choose any three to complete the assignment. So you could do it like across a module. So they have to complete so many by the end of the module, by the end of the timeline. It could be topically based, but this way it gives some options of what you might have students to be able to do. And in thinking about what you want them to accomplish and what the goals are, then I think it's easier to find something already in existence that would very much meet your needs. Maybe you want them to work with some video, so you might have them record the explanation. Maybe you want them to find some do some work with some graphics or drawings, and so they can utilize the Bitmojis or the emojis, or even just a generalized drawing app. Maybe that you might have them to um, create a graphic using an Adobe Spark or a Canva or something kind of simple like that. But something that kind of puts them out into a space where they have to do something different um, can produce some really amazing work. So I think first, if you're thinking about how to use assessment and how to offer student agency and student choice with assessments, you have to think about what you want to be able to evaluate and what are the different ways that you can offer students to be able to do that. I think that some of the things you have to consider are what students know and what they natively have access to, and how much front end explanation you have to do, especially if it's a new platform or a technology that might not be as familiar. Because I think they disengage sometimes if we don't do a good job on the front end of explaining how some of these different softwares and platforms work. But then also, I think that the more that I continue to model and remind that the productive struggle sometimes is what I want them to experience, they're more willing to branch out and to create some really amazing things. And then the last part of engaging students that I want to talk about is kind of a this or that. So if we're thinking about differentiation, if we're thinking about things that we're doing to our instruction, to our learning modules, to our online courses, to the learning activities, we have to think about what we're doing currently, what we want to do, and what we can use to make that happen. So one example of that is um, using written feedback. So some of the examples you can see are, instead of writing annotations in the body of a piece of work, you only write annotations in the body of work as the teacher, and the student has to write an overall review highlighting 2 strengths and 1 area for improvement. So you're giving feedback, but the student is also having to engage with the piece of work. So within whatever they've composed, they're having to reflectively take a look at it. Maybe instead of writing annotations in the body of the piece of work, you only write an overall comment, and you have the student annotate the specific areas of the work where the strengths are apparent or where improvement needs to be made. Instead of writing extensive comments, maybe you only give 1 strength and 1 possible improvement. And then the student works to close the gap of the 1 particular one identified. Instead of writing, well done, you have whatever it is, and explaining all of the good points of the work, you just put a double tick next to the best parts. And so maybe simplifying the feedback is a good way to not only get students engaged in exploring that, but also gives them an opportunity. So everywhere there's a tick, the student would have to add a reason for those. So why does the student feel like that those were the ones that maybe you marked specifically for that area? Instead of marking every question or every aspect in detail, maybe you only, as a teacher, mark the highlighted questions in detail or the areas that you feel like need the most attention. Check your marks, see where the biggest impact would be made. And marks, or if this were a peer assessment, the peer marks would be the work prior to submission. So maybe you're going to use some of these review aspects before whatever this project is submitted, or maybe you use this as part of a group project where they have to evaluate each other's contributions. Instead of writing the same explanation on every piece of work, I feel like I do this a lot sometimes. When you start to see a common error or a common misconception, then take a note that this is something that needs some class time, this needs some extra attention, and have students to write their own correct answers. So you address it as a common misconception or as something that everyone needs, that you were saying consistently, and have students to go back and correct that on their end from a class feedback perspective. Instead of writing out a full solution when a student gets a question wrong, you write a hint to the next step, and the student has to complete the correction. Instead of correcting work when a student makes a little mistake, maybe some clues, some acronyms, something that draws their attention to what is wrong with this. And then in that particular set of feedback, you have the student to go back and correct whatever the error they feel like might be there. Instead of giving back work and moving straight on, give students time to close the gap, making everything that you're doing that sometimes they don't look at because they're just looking at the grade, making that worth it. So there's no specific way that giving feedback works, that improving skills and addressing engagement works, but definitely noting that engagement has to be twofold. So it has to be something that you can strategically plan so that there is a student response to whatever you are trying to get them to accomplish. I think sometimes I feel like that students kind of just throw this plate of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks and just kind of wait for what the marks are in the feedback. So I think to be able to combat that, to get them involved and engaged is very important. There's a couple more examples of do this instead of that. This one is specific to online synchronous, online asynchronous, or face-to-face distance. So if you're wanting to engage students in a think, pair, share. So online synchronous, you might use breakout rooms. Online asynchronous, you might use Flipgrid. You might use a discussion board. You might use just a small group chat platform or chat group. Face-to-face physically distance, you divide the class into pairs or ask them to choose a partner. And so the same thing, it kind of goes down. What are some of your common group activities? What are some of the things that you do as far as trying to engage students actively in learning, whether it's small group discussion, turn and talk, partial outlines, pausing in the lecture, posters and gallery walks, fish bowls, polling, quick write, muddiest points, four corners if we're reflecting on our learning, what's missing, an aha wall, strengthening understanding. And I really like this chart because it breaks down how this could work both in a synchronous environment and an asynchronous environment, as well as in the classroom. I think sometimes that it's easy to compartmentalize, well, this would only work for online, or this only works if we're face-to-face. And I think that with the ever-changing landscape and how we have to continue to try to adapt and adopt new ways to engage students. I think that it's important to look at it through a multifaceted lens. To be able to look at this through a technology lens, the SAMR charts are probably some of my favorites in thinking about what are some common classroom activities and how can I engage students in those using different tools. And so SAMR is substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. And so it's really like a digital taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy for what the technology is supposed to do as far as what the common piece is, what the foundation is, and how we want that to move from one to another. Here's an example using all Microsoft apps. So if we're thinking this bottom row is what we might do as a learning activity, if it's an assessment, if it's how we're turning in work, if it's research, discussion, a speech, poster, an image, or just a paper. And that would be just the activity as it currently is. The redefinition is that first level of allowing the technology to just replicate whatever that activity is. And so there's the word specific ways that you could use some of those, or Word, Office 365 specific apps, that the ways that you could redefine what the learning activity is. If you're going to move up the order to modification, that means that there's something that's having to be different in the way that the learning activity is designed. But still, it's using some similar applications, just in a little different way. And then the next level is augmentation. And that's how the technology begins to really substitute and make it functionally better. So there are more improvements than just replicating or redesigning the activity. And then finally, the substitution is where the technology does something that could not be done before. And so this doesn't always work in every class, in every environment, in every setting. But I do think it's helpful to look at what we plan as our learning activities and kind of try to explore ways that we can get students to redesign their thinking. And sometimes that uses different technologies and sometimes it doesn't. But I think most importantly, whether you do or whether you don't use the technology, is being willing to explore, is it helpful? Does it improve the learning? Or is it going to slow down the process? So that's all the big ideas and the main points for how to engage students through a variety of ways. I know that that's a somewhat overwhelming perspective of how do you do all that alongside what you're doing in your courses. But I think for me, just continuing to be willing to work with them and model what I want them to see is maybe my biggest takeaway from how to engage students. Yeah, so at if you'll scroll back up in the chat, the link for everything that I just demoed and walked through is there for you to have access to. Wakelet, if you don't use Wakelet, is a free platform, and Office 365 bought it, so it's nothing that requires a membership. But yes, you should all have access to everything that I've shared.
Thank you.
Chris, I'll pass it back over to you if there's no questions, if there's no follow-up thoughts or
Yeah,
further
yeah,
tips.
Yeah, I'm asking. I asked, does anyone have any questions about anything at all? That was a lot to absorb, both in theory and strategy and tools. Was there anything that anyone saw that really? Oh, I just disappeared. Is there anything that anyone saw that stuck out to them, or that you wanted to build upon, or ask about, or add to? Because like I know some people in this room are some good talkers, so don't be bashful now. Gotta adjust my. No, no questions. Well, I just want to say thank you for to Andrea for coming and talk to us today and for sharing so much information and so many resources. I encourage all of you to look at that wakelet. There's a lot of great stuff. I've been perusing it myself, and thank you so much for being here, Andrea. And if you have any questions, follow up questions that you'd rather ask her one on one, then here I'm sure she won't mind you emailing her. Her email is amrains@jsu.edu, and you can find her on Teams. I find her on Teams. And if you have any questions for me, you can find me too. Yes, the recording will be made available on the team site, and it'll also be available through other avenues as well. So everyone, please give Andrea a round of thanks, and thank you for being here this afternoon, Andrea. Really, you really appreciate it. I appreciate you, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thanks,
You
everybody.
too.
Thanks,
Thank
Chris.
you.